I wanted to begin today by explaining what I am, rather than who I am, as Mark has already there kindly done for everybody. I am an intellectual historian, and because we are a multidisciplinary group, I thought it might be useful to explain what being an intellectual historian means, besides sounding vaguely pretentious, which I realize it does. What we are particularly interested in are the languages and the concepts and the storylines, the narrative forms that shape our understanding of the world. And our argument in general is that these have real effects on the real world, as we fondly call it. And so I was absolutely delighted when I saw the title of this marvelous gathering that we have for this week, narrating disasters in the Anthropocene, knowledges, memories, and imaginaries. Because I really liked both the singular of the Anthropocene, which, as we've heard from the scientists in our midst, is a state shift in the Earth system. It is defined primarily through the geologists who are giving us the articulation of the kinds of evidence that they're discovering and the kind of predicament that we face. But I really like the plurals in this title too, knowledges, memories, and imaginaries, because that suggests, and I think we've gotten this as well already in this conference, that there are many ways of telling this story. So what I'm going to do today is to focus on stories, not just the stories we tell, but the kinds of stories we tell. And I want us to move from what I think of as Holocene stories to Anthropocene stories. What is the crucial difference in these two framings? And one, of course, of the differences, one of the major differences, is that we move from change over time, which historians in many other fields have long been interested in, to trying to figure out what this mid-20th century rupture in the Earth system now means for all of us. How do we narrate this moment of disastrous transformation? So what I'm going to do today is talk about types of stories, as I said. And I'm going to use the number 3 because this is traditional in storytelling. There's the 3 wishes, the 3 sisters, the 3 ages of woman and sometimes of man. And of course my favorite 3, which is the 3 vinegar tasters, where each of these religious philosophical figures in East Asia dipped their fingers into a barrel of vinegar and give 3 very different interpretations of what it tastes like. So 3 is a major factor in many stories, but I want to talk about 3 kinds of stories with which we're approaching the Anthropocene. And I'm going to define these in this way. One is anything goes. We can connect the anthropos of the Anthropocene with the scene, with the sense of time, in any way we choose. And I would say, at least looking over the humanities and social sciences, that this is the way most people are approaching it. But I think there are 2 much more important and serious ways of approaching the Anthropocene, of taking the anthropos and the scene and putting them together. One is the interdisciplinary way of creating a single integrated story of humans, time, and planet that move together. And the other is a multidisciplinary way, saying that there are different stories about a single shared reality. So these are the 3 I'm going to talk about, just to give you an overview. I know many of you are jet-lagged. Good luck. I'm pretty jet-lagged myself. So let me start with Anything Goes, which is, of course, the title of a musical. And many, many people have taken this term and decided to play with it. And they've had a lot of fun. The homogenocene, is a very interesting term. It refers to the way in which species have been moved across the planet. and we have a much more homogeneous ecosystem everywhere we look. There's certainly a truth in that. The Multidisciplinary, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. How many people know what that means? Raise your hand. Oh, goody. I'm stumped. This means the age of jellyfish and the age of slimy creatures. True enough. It is in fact the case that jellyfish are flourishing. They like the 2 degrees. They like the warmer seawater, they like the fact that there's less oxygen in our seawater, and they love the fact that their competitors for the food that they eat have been largely, their numbers are declining, so this is also a true story. The Thermocene is about heat. The Anthropocene, of course, refers to the planet of death that we are confronting in many ways. So these terms are useful, they redirect our interests, they redirect our attention, and of course many people to this conference have been mesmerized by the age of chickens. Not to fall behind, not to be out of the flow of this conversation. I too have a chicken. This is one in Java near Borobudur, the house of chickens, a large prayer house. I'm not quite sure whether you pray to the chicken or whether you pray about the number of chickens that we have on the planet, but you can certainly visit this along with a major Buddhist temple should you wish to do so. So there is this anything goes approach, which is interesting to me, but I don't know how helpful it is. I get particularly nervous in the more serious forms that it takes within disciplines, such as what is happening in history, where the idea is to define or redefine the Anthropocene, not as geologists are doing it, but as historians might wish to see it. And I'll talk about my discipline. I think this is happening in many other disciplines. And this is the idea that, well, the geologists have their Anthropocene, but we in history can think about this in other ways. And I've got this quote up here which says the Anthropocene began in different times and in different places. In fact, we can have an Anthropocene in Venice as early as 1750. Well, no. You can't have an Anthropocene just in Venice in 1750. The Anthropocene, if it is to mean anything, is a globally synchronous stratum, and it is accompanied by a state shift in the Earth system. And this predilection for defining this term within one's own discipline actually gets in the way, I think, of our having conversations that need to be had. Another form of anything goes is to double down on a kind of undisciplined knowledge, often focusing on those evil geologists. And we have Mark Williams here, an example of these evil geologists, so you know how fierce they are. And some of them have been, well, in fact, Mark is part of the Anthropocene Working Group, and Will is part of the Anthropocene Working Group, has been accused of making a terrible mistake in defining the Anthropocene stratigraphically. And I don't quite understand where this critique comes from. It's like, what did you expect from geologists? It's sort of like accusing historians of using words. Well, yes, what else? And it goes on and with a kind of fierceness, which I think is shooting the messenger instead of listening to the message. So we got the proposal that for some reason geologists are oblivious to ecosystems and to life, although you just heard Mark Williams talk about exactly that, how the biosphere has been threatened. You get the idea that geologists are human species supremacist planetary politicians of some kind, which is pretty impressive. I don't know how you do that early in the morning. They blame everybody on the planet, or they inadequately blame capitalism instead of and instead focus on rocks. And I think these critiques are really interesting because they wish to say geologists should stop being geologists. What they need to do is be whatever it is I am. They're bad historians. Well, okay, they're bad historians, but maybe that's something I could do. Or they're inadequately analyzing economic systems. But maybe that's something that economic historians or even economists, heaven forfend, might have a look at and figure out how to talk about better without relying on a geologist to do that for us. And I think that a lot of this comes from a rootedness in Holocene stories, a sense that of how difficult it is to move away from the categories and thought patterns that we learned in the Holocene to another way of thinking in the Anthropocene. So that you get this phrase about white geology, which is the idea that somehow geologists are engaged in exploitation, dispossession, subjection, and other and closely tied to the slave mode of production. I'm not sure how helpful these approaches are. And instead, as I say, I think they're continuing the idea of that was formed on a planet that had enough bounty so that we could tell any story we wanted to. The planet was probabilistic, systems supported many experiments, we could live in many different ways, we could struggle and fight for our interests. But that's not the planet we live on anymore. We have to figure out how to tell other stories about this planet, which means that we're going to have to change a lot of things. We're going to have to change our language and move away from the kinds of stories of individualism and rights, which are the stories that I sharpened my eye teeth on. I always thought these were great ideas. I wanted history to trace that great arc towards moral justice that Martin Luther King described for us. I wanted to move towards abundance and bounty and possibilities for every human being on this planet. But instead, that is now impossible. If we were to divide the wealth of the planet by the number of people on the planet now, we would all be living between $8,000 and $9,000 a year. And that's only going to go down as the number of people goes up. In some countries, this would be an enormous boost in income. In others, of course, it would be a great decline. The system that would produce that kind of radical justice would certainly not allow for a conference like this one. There simply wouldn't be the kind of capital accumulation that could allow for us all to travel and live as we do. And that's a sobering thought. So how do we begin to tell stories in relationship to this planet and the way we've overstretched its boundaries? And I want to now move to the wonderful other keynote, the truly wonderful keynote, by Will Steffen, and return to his graph that he showed you, which is describing the new trajectory of our planet away from Holocene variability towards what looks like, with business as usual, hothouse Earth, which would be an extremely difficult place to live. And what this graph is suggesting, and Will, of course, can correct me or embellish if necessary, is that we don't have that kind of hope and based on abundance that we once had in describing this planet. The best hope now is to somehow manage to stabilize the Earth system at about 2 degrees with whatever biodiversity we can wrench and rescue from our predations, and manage to keep it in what I understand to be an artificial state. That is a very tall order. How do we do that? That is demanding of us something truly unprecedented, and also a story, it has a storyline to it, which is not a story that is utopian in any sense, as many of our modern stories were. It is, in fact, the opposite of that. Our very best hope would still be a rather grim world, but better than the other. So we have to look for that comic angel of history, which says, not look at the disasters, but could have been worse. So that's what we've got now. So the question is, how do we tell the stories could have been worse? And I think there are 2 of them. One is to suggest a kind of integrated, interdisciplinary knowledge. And the other is to suggest a multidisciplinary, many-storied forms of knowledge that aims at thinking about this common goal of a stabilized Earth system. And Will, quite radically, and he looks like such a mild man, he's waving an enormous flag in front of us all and listing what needs to be done. A fundamental reorientation of human values, equity, behavior, institutions, economies, and technologies. I mean, this is gasp-inducing. How in the world we get there? And as I read this really moving and brilliant essay, which I ended in tears at the end of this, really, not bedtime reading, it seemed to me that there was 2 stories pointed out even within the language of this single essay. One is one suggests a deep integration of knowledge, the biophysical, the geochemical, everything, and then the humanities and social sciences and the art as well, into one form of knowledge. And then this other story, or other stories, and the plural is important here, about building resistance and redundancy and talking about the many-storied past and future. So I want to talk first about the integrated story, which brings all the disciplines together and figures out the great story of the human species on the planet. We've been around for 300,000 years, give or take, as you know, and all this time we've been involved with rocks. This is the oldest cave paintings. They've just discovered these in Indonesia. Evidently there's 2 sets of hands here, about 20,000 years apart. Human beings have had their hands on rocks for a long, long time. So it makes sense to tell our story as integrated with our geological home. And we see this not just in our species, but in an amazing species which was discovered in June of this year, very recently, a rock-eating shipworm. We knew they ate wood. That was a problem, of course, with the great explorations. But it turns out they also eat rock. And frankly, I'm kind of dismayed to know this. I mean, this is like terrifying. I mean, as a scientist said. But we too eat rock rather fundamentally. And I'm going now to my home country, in a way, to Japan, to talk about real wasabi. You may have thought you were eating wasabi when you were eating that green-dyed horseradish that is served with the sushi. And you might have enjoyed it. I like it. Fabulous green dye. But real wasabi is only grown on a particular peninsula with a particular kind of volcanic soil that gives it just the right taste. And if you scrape it from the plant and eat it within no later than 20 minutes later, then you get the real taste, which is imbued with this rock. That's real wasabi. And of course, this is true of all the plants we eat, and indeed all the animals that we eat. Ultimately, they rely on rocks in the soil from these rocks. So we can certainly tell this story, this one unified story of our species on this planet as a species forcing. Although it is difficult, as Dipesh Chakrabarty said, to imagine what that might look like, many people are doing some very good work to try to imagine this story. For instance, Kyle Harper has discussed disinfecting the planet, how we both unconsciously gained various immunities and turned epidemic diseases into endemic diseases, and then gradually over millennia began to develop customs and habits that made us less susceptible to the dangerous parts of our microbiome, including cooking food, taking off our shoes, dealing with sewage, and ultimately with antibiotics. And indeed, you can do a deep history of the human species in relationship to the planet and talk about how embedded our story is and the great length of this embedded story. The same is true as Mark and I were talking, and Boatson were talking over breakfast, about the technosphere. This is a way of telling a unified story. And this type of story tends to produce a single agent, which is the planet-time human coming together to create the Anthropocene. Now, this is a true story. This is a possible story. This is in some ways a very effective story for understanding what's going on. But it's based on a particular kind of scale. And it's not the only type of scale that's involved, that's possible for us to use. This is an integrated scale, the sort of Russian doll scale, where it goes from smaller to larger, you can fit things neatly in one another, so that human history is a subset of biology, is a subset of chemistry, is a subset of physics. As you'll see, a lot of the things I'm using up here are in quotations. I know who said them. I wonder how many of you all do. So there is this possibility of telling the story this way. It ends up, in many respects, being a deeply deterministic story. In fact, the person that said this speculates that if there were a hominid species on a planet like our own, they too would have destroyed this planet. This is a story, in many ways, of a kind of inevitable end. But the question for people like myself who practice critical history is the effort always to point out the fact that we didn't have to get here, and therefore we might be able to have a different future from the one that we arrived at. So we need more than one solution, more than one agent, more than one integrated story, as well as this integrated story. And I'm quite ecumenical here. I think the integrated story is useful in some respects, but for many of us, it's the multidisciplinary approach, the multi-storied approach, which will give us many actors over many different sorts of scale, which will produce more possibilities as long as they are in relationship to the Anthropocene and the state shift that we have entered. So this multidisciplinary approach is quite different from anything goes. It's grounded in this problem of the Anthropocene, which means that we are now facing, I'm going in the wrong direction. Oops. Now I've done it. This means that we are now facing impossible stories. And it's just as important to talk about the impossible stories that are now no longer available to us in the Anthropocene. Oh, thank you. Which include stories like infinite growth, a story that many people in politics and economics apparently still believe to this day, that we can continue to grow our economies infinitely on our finite planet. It also means that we have to give up on the great dream of abundance and individual liberty for all, with the focus on the individual. We need now to move to far more communitarian views of the kind of good life that we can lead, or the not so bad life that we might be able to lead. We also need to move away from the stories that tell us that all will be well because we can dematerialize the economy and technology will take care of us. Most of you will recognize this as the eco-modernist story, for which there seems to be astoundingly little evidence that we can actually get away from living on this material planet. And finally, with great regret, we have to give up on the redemption story. And this is a story that you find rather surprisingly even in the lovely book Timefulness by geologist Marcia Bornrud, I think is how she says her name, that just came out from Princeton, where she says we can go back to the Holocene. Yes, there's the Anthropocene, but we can reel it all in. If you've gotten nothing from this conference, I think you've gotten the point that we can't reel it all in. We're not going back. Sadly, that redemption story is not available. And so there are many impossible stories in the Anthropocene, but there's more than one story in many respects. First of all, there are the many stories that could be told about human societies that don't end up in the Anthropocene. Yes, of course, there's stories about economic development, about globalization, about the rise of human population that do end up in the Anthropocene. But we need perhaps to recapitulate or recapture those human stories that produce sustainable societies that were going in quite different trajectories, that have now been sucked into this Anthropocene, but may give us clues about how to go forward. So just because those stories did not become the dominant story doesn't mean we don't have something to learn from them. And all good critical historians would say that would be a good idea because that will allow us to have many more imaginaries for the future, to get back to the title of this conference. So we need to get back to talking about, as in Mark's phrase, mutualistic relationships at various levels of the planetary system. Yes, the whole planetary system, but also these smaller stories located in the specific histories here of Japan and India and other efforts that are being made quite locally. But it's not just human beings who have many stories. There are also many stories amongst species. It is quite true that we face biodiversity collapse. And one of the most terrible ways in which we face it, and I've learned this from Mark, is that we are about to lose the velvet worm. I was confused, and I was despairing about many things. I didn't even know I had to be despairing about the velvet worm until quite recently. The velvet worm, for those of you who don't know, is a creature which is precious because it represents a phylum that is, if we were to lose it, would represent a branch of life for which there are not many representatives as there are, and should we lose it, then we're really cutting off an entire tree limb of the branch of life. And these amazing little things hunt in groups, and they eat hierarchically. And the female member, the highest ranking female member of this little predatory group gets to eat first. So many stories, even among species, as well as the stories of their collapse in other ways. So what's interesting about these multidisciplinary stories, these many stories, is that they treat scale rather differently. This is not a hierarchical scale. This is not a scale where everything fits neatly inside the larger version of itself. Instead, this is trying to look at scale as something which is created by looking at partial connections, or the friction amongst different scales, the incommensurability of ways that one can tell different stories, the lack of neat hierarchy, and trying to emphasize the fact that yes, we can see things in relationship to each other, but the world is not in the form of neat hierarchical scales in all cases. And in fact, this kind of scaling may allow us to take into account the tipping points and feedback loops and sudden ruptures, which we are going to face more and more in the coming years and decades, because this allows us greater flexibility. So in summing up my comments today, I want to say that I think the multidisciplinary approach sometimes gets lost when we face something as stunning and horrifying and enormous as the Anthropocene. But that when we recuperate it, when we begin to focus on it, we can begin to see that it too is a useful story. We no longer live on a probabilistic Holocene Earth anymore. So the anything goes approach, the idea that somehow the Earth can support all the stories that human beings might want to tell about themselves, is no longer realistic. It's also true with the multidisciplinary story that you get a democracy of voices. And I used to think of democracy as being about rights, as being about those things we needed to grant to other people because we wanted them ourselves. But in the Anthropocene, I think a better way to think about democracy is to say that we need all hands on deck. We need the insights, the imaginaries, the metaphors, the hopes of all sorts of people, because we don't know how to stabilize the Earth's system entirely. In fact, although we have some good ideas, we need population to level off, we need to stop pumping so much CO2 in the air. We don't know how to stabilize the Earth system. How do you go about that? And so one of the reasons for having many stories is to ask many people. And the only way to listen to them, to really hear their stories, is to suggest that democracy is not something you grant to other people because you somehow are kind enough to recognize that they have rights too. But democracy is essential for the practices that will save us, such that we can be saved not in a redemptory sense, but in a mitigatory sense, that we will live in a less bad planet rather than a really bad planet. And so I want to say how important I think this conference is, how grateful I am to Bruce Park for bringing us all together here. Because I think the effort here has been to listen for these multidisciplinary stories that we have been trying to tell one another across the vast gulfs of our different disciplines. But it's not just about what happens in this room. What's so important about what's happening at KAIST and at a very few other institutions in the world, but not nearly enough, is that we're beginning to develop the institutional support that will allow for precisely these kinds of multidisciplinary stories. So thank you, Bruce.
We have time for a question for Julia.
Do I stay up here?
I think
Come
so.
up here too.
Sure, stage.
Sorry.
Will?
Thanks very much, Julia. That was an absolutely superb presentation on taking the Anthropocene steps further in terms of how we need to deal with it. And I think what we've done here with the multidisciplinary approach is to describe really in a much more understandable way what complex system science also said exactly the same thing. You need a pluralistic bunch of ideas bubbling up. You can't predict what's going to come out. You don't know exactly where the tipping point's going to lie, but we need this pluralism in knowledge to help us move toward that tipping point. So I think it's a really excellent framing of where we need to go, and it certainly fits in, I think, very well with what Bruce System Science is now saying about it. So thanks for really putting it together, I think, in an excellent way.
I learned a lot of it from your paper, Will. You're right up there.
Further questions? Julia, I think we've got time for one more. Gabrielle?
Julia, yes, of course, fabulous presentation. So, I love your point about the types of scales, hierarchical scales versus other types, right? Scales that are about extent, scales that are, there's sort of lots of different kinds, as you've said, much more articulately than I currently can. So, can you imagine for us how you would visualize a set of apparently incommensurable scales that can nevertheless be brought together to tell stories that involve, both geological, biological, and social forms of knowledge making?
Well, I suppose that's sort of what I tried to do when I asked the question of who is the we, who is in danger, and took it through many different scales. And I know you've read this essay, so I feel ridiculous saying to you, because we've had a lot of discussions about scale. Gabrielle and I think in many ways the same way. But for the rest of you, I wrote a piece asking this question, who's the we, who's in danger? And of course, when you look at the science of who this we might be, it's described in very different ways. If you describe us as the species, it's very likely that we will stagger on. There will be some Homo sapiens, millennia from now. And Kurt Steger, who is some sort of scientist, I forget what sort of scientist it is right now, forgive me, says, well, it'll be fine even if we go up to Eocene temperatures, which is about 18 degrees Fahrenheit, I don't know what that is in Celsius, and we will be just fine. And I'm thinking, fine? Fine in what way? Well, what he means is that the species will survive. So there's that scale. But on the micro scale of humans, there are weird ways in which we survive and don't survive. If you look, for instance, at our microbiome, this claim that we are mostly made up of bacterial cells, 90% according to some people, those cells are going to do just fine. I mean, if that's really what 90% of us are, those single-cell organisms, although they seem to thrive on us, they'll probably do all right. They can reproduce like crazy. I mean, they'll figure it out. So there's that, but there's also at the same scale, the micro scale, there's the introduction of toxins into our system, which you suggested.
Can I interrupt you for a second? Because really, I meant my question a lot more literally. So, Will gave us this awesome graphic that you also use, right, mm-hmm. where the Earth is kind of, it looks like a gravity wave if you try to visualize that. And that is a super, I've found that a super effective way to communicate what we're doing. So I'm really literally asking, maybe it's not a question just for you, it's really a question for us, all of us. Can we think of other ways to visualize the kind of scalar work that we need to do, right? So a hierarchy, we know how to visualize a hierarchy, right? A line, a metric, we know how to visualize a metric. So do we need, other ways of visualizing bubbles, three-dimensional? Should we be building, like an architectural model? I'm just
Well, I'm thinking
spinning out
about that,
ideas.
and the reason
but-
I'm annoyingly flipping through these things is that this fractal scale here is what I'm trying to suggest might be a way of thinking about scales. Fractals are produced mathematically, and this particular scale, these things have relations to one another, but there's not a hierarchy here. So that's one way of thinking about scale. What Marilyn Stratum does I'm thinking of Moll's work, MOL's work, Moll's work.
Yeah.
Where she's talking about what is a disease, and she does an ethnography of a hospital, and disease looks different for everybody who looks at it. Marilyn Stratum looks at initiation rites, and they look quite different. So I think this way of saying, drawing the notion that where there's similarities, there's something that holds these things together, but it's not necessarily hierarchical. And I don't know whether this particular fractal scale is the visual that works best. I'd love to have a better one if there is one. Maybe you could send me one.
Maybe that could be a project that I think we could all try to do together.
Yeah, let's get some artists in here and try to figure out what this looks like. Yeah, thank you, Gabrielle.
I'd like to close this session then. I think there's a 10-minute coffee break now.
Yes.
So about 10:55.
Yes.
And could we just thank Julia again, please, before we leave the room?